When my friend first introduced me to the dark web, I was amazed at how such an unknown thing could house some of the most illegal things on Earth. Up until today, I had only used it for learning how to code and commit small crimes, but after the horrifying videos I just found, I don't think I'll ever use the dark web again. I first met my best friend Alex when a little bit after I got into high school. My parents had moved us to a new town and I had no friends. It was lonely at first, but I got used to it. We moved because they were paranoid after many murders occurred in our town. I thought this was weird, moving across the country over that, but I let it go. The reason Alex and I became friends so quickly was because we both had a shared interest in the internet and everything it had to offer. I was a gaming addict and a Tier 3 Pokemon subscriber, while he was more of a coder and developer. 2 years later, we were still best friends, but now we were much older and smarter. Alex had discovered the dark web, and he was obsessed with it. He pretty much spent every hour of the day on it, searching through anything you could imagine. There was nothing wrong with this, but one search he made was the biggest mistake of his entire life. I remember waking up to dozens of text messages from him one morning. This wasn't normal. Alex wasn't a very social person, and it was very hard to get words out of him. I opened my phone to see what he had messaged me. "Dude, Jack, you have to come over right now. This is important. Jack, please wake up. This is urgent. Where are you?" These were only some of the messages, but the rest were very similar, with them all being urgent, and that I needed to go to his house immediately. My parents were both at work still, so I went over to Alex's house. When I arrived, there were 4 cop cars parked in front of his house, and there were dozens of people and news vans standing out front. I made my way through the crowd, and Alex's mother told the police to let me inside. I could see tears rolling down her cheeks as she opened the door. "What's going on, Mrs. Gonzalez?" I asked. "Alex missing," she said as she started crying. My heart sank. How could this happen? He had just texted me earlier that morning. That was when it hit me. What if he was trying to warn me? What if his text messages were related to his disappearance? Still in shock, I walked up to one of the detectives in the kitchen. "Is Alex going to be okay?" I asked. "Of course he is. He's going to be just fine. We're going to find him very soon," one of the detectives responded. Something about that response was off. It was like I knew he was wrong. Deep down, I had the slight feeling that I wasn't going to see him ever again. I remembered the text messages, however, and pulled out my phone to show it to the detective. He texted me this morning. "What if this has something to do with him going missing?" I said swiftly. As he began reading them, his expression quickly changed. It was like it got worse. He told me they needed to keep my phone for now to investigate the text messages, and said they would give it back to me later. I stayed around the house for a while, not just because I missed Alex, but because I wanted to comfort his parents. They cared about me a lot, and it hurt to see them like that. His mother couldn't stop crying. Eventually, however, I went into Alex's room to see if I could find anything that might give a clue about why he went missing. I searched through everything, but I found nothing. But then I noticed something. Alex's computer was on, but his monitor was turned off. I looked for the button to turn it on and hit it. As the screen lit up, my heart sank. He was on the dark web. Obviously, this was normal, but for some reason, he had dozens of different tabs opened. I knew this part wasn't normal, so I closed the door and locked it, and began going through them. At first, it was all pretty usual for him, but then things started to get weird. He had a tab open that was an article about a murder that had happened several years ago. The article said that it was a woman who was found dead in her apartment. Her body was mutilated, cut up, and covered in acid. I nearly threw up reading it and seeing the horrifying pictures of the crime scene. Not wanting to see any of it anymore, I switched the tab just to reveal another article about another murder. Confused, I quickly went through the rest of the tabs he had open, and they were all the same thing. They all were about some type of murder or crime. The one that stuck out the most to me, however, was one about a murder that had happened 2 years ago. At first it seemed pretty normal, but as I read further, I realized what it was. It was about the murder of our neighbor that prompted us to move away. Confusion quickly swept over me. How did Alex know about this? I never told him about it, because to me it wasn't that important. I figured it must have just been a strange coincidence. But then I saw the last search he had made on his computer. It was my last name. Horrified and confused, I quickly stumbled out of his room and back to the living room. "Is everything all right?" Alex's mother said, sniffing away her tears. "Yeah, I just need to go home for dinner," I responded. On the way home, so many questions and thoughts filled my mind. Why was he searching up my last name? Did he think that I had something to do with this? That must have been why he was texting me so frantically that morning. If only I could just explain to him that I didn't do anything wrong, but I couldn't. He was still missing, and I had to find out why. When I got home, I raced to my room and slammed the bedroom door shut and got on my computer. I loaded up my Tor browser and turned my VPN on. I knew what I had to do. I began typing in the letters of my last name, becoming more nervous after every letter. When I finally hit enter, nothing happened. It was just a blank screen. Confused, I refreshed the page, but once again there was nothing. But why did Alex search this if there was nothing? I thought to myself. There must be something out there. I was getting ready to close the tab, thinking I had ran into a dead end, when suddenly the page started to load. It took several minutes, but finally it loaded to reveal hundreds of videos. Immediately I knew what they were. They were murders. But why did they show up when you searched my last name? I considered just stopping right there and turning back, knowing the horrifying things I would see if I continued on. But I couldn't. I knew this had to be why Alex went missing. So I clicked on the first video. As it started playing, I saw what looked like a woman strapped to a chair in some sort of basement or something. I quickly recognized who it was. It was our neighbor from 2 years ago. I could tell because she had the same heart-shaped tattoo on her neck. She sat there for a minute, struggling, panicking, and screaming for someone to help. However, suddenly, 2 figures walked into frame. At first, I couldn't tell who they were, but as they turned around to face the camera, my heart sank. It was my parents. My father was holding a knife, while my mother was holding a small scalpel. They paused for a moment before they started what was the most horrifying 5 minutes of my entire life. I watched as they cut her into pieces and listened as she begged for mercy, screaming the whole time. Blood filled the room as she took her last breath. When the video ended, it quickly went to another, revealing the exact same room and chair I had seen before. I was traumatized by what I had already seen, and I knew I couldn't watch any more of it. My parents were murderers, and I now knew the real reason we moved away 2 years ago. I knew there was something off about that, but I just never could have imagined that this was the horrifying secret that they had been hiding from me. This whole time I thought Alex was trying to accuse me of being responsible for these murders. But I was so wrong. He was trying to warn me. I scanned through more of the videos, each in the exact same room. I was just about finished, ready to go to the police so that I could tell them about what I had just seen, when I noticed something. There was a new video uploaded today on the website. I quickly clicked on it and pressed play to reveal what looked like a man this time, strapped to the chair. He had a sack over his face, and I couldn't tell who it was. Once again, however, I saw my parents walk into the frame. My father walked up to the man and pulled the sack off his head. At first, I couldn't tell who it was, but then I realized who I was looking at. It was Alex. I wish I'd never watched that video. I thought I'd grow out of shit like that by the time I'd hit 20. Yet there I was, off my tits on some choice MDMA Jeff hooked us up with, touring through some kind of hardcore sadomasochism site. The kind of videos you're surprised are out on the dark web. If you ever stumbled across the Pain Olympics or 4chan, you'll know what I'm talking about. When I was a teenager, mates, and I would gather round the PC screen, playing chicken to see who could watch the most extreme content without leaving the room or puking. This was like that, but with a tablet and nobody is sober. In my defense, it wasn't my idea. Luke's cousin was down for the weekend, young lad, about 16 I think. Not too bright, but kept himself to himself, which meant he wasn't going to get us caught sneaking him into the rave underage. As usual, afterwards we found ourselves at a flat party, and then in Luke's bedroom. It wasn't until about 4 a.m., when those who were able had sauntered off to get laid, that the usual rounds of spliff and internet began. This was when Luke's cousin started suggesting weirder and weirder shit. We all thought at first that it was just the Mandy. He was young after all, and teenage desire to be seen as edgy mixed with come-down anxiety was a plausible explanation. After a while, though, one of us I was too fucked to remember who, but I hope it wasn't me, started to entertain his suggestions. Everybody there enjoy horror films after all. We'd had more than one 4 a.m. or hostile marathon after a night out. What was the harm? Soon enough we found ourselves in the familiar group cringe and out loud OHHHHH. There was then, of course, the unending debate over whatever macabre footage we'd just put ourselves through was real. We dug to the point of a woman using a kitchen knife to scalp herself, and a man pulling his own toes off with a pair of pliers, when we found ... it. Luke's cousin was in control by that point. We hadn't noticed how quiet he'd gotten. He sat there on the floor, legs crossed, leaning forward every so often to click the next video. Had this look on his face the whole time, like he was searching for something specific. He never skipped anything, though. No matter what the video showed, he just sat back, watching whatever was making the rest of us make melodramatic retching noises unfold. Once one video finished, he scoured the algorithm's suggestions for the next. He'd ignored all of ours by this point, so we'd stopped bothering. We were more than a few blunts into our session, and holding our focus on anything other than the rich conversation about which of the girls we knew would be a good smash was difficult. I wish I'd never watched that video. I thought I'd grow out of shit like that by the time I'd hit 20. Yet there I was, off my tits on some choice MDMA Jeff hooked us up with, touring through some kind of hardcore sadomasochism site. The kind of videos you're surprised are out on the dark web. If you ever stumbled across the Pain Olympics or 4chan, you'll know what I'm talking about. When I was a teenager, mates, and I would gather round the PC screen, playing chicken to see who could watch the most extreme content without leaving the room or puking. This was like that, but with a tablet and nobody is sober. In my defense, it wasn't my idea. Luke's cousin was down for the weekend, young lad, about 16 I think. Not too bright, but kept himself to himself, which meant he wasn't going to get us caught sneaking him into the rave underage. As usual, afterwards we found ourselves at a flat party, and then in Luke's bedroom. It wasn't until about 4 a.m., when those who were able had sauntered off to get laid that the usual rounds of spliff and internet began. This was when Luke's cousin started suggesting weirder and weirder shit. We all thought at first that it was just the Mandy. He was young after all, and teenage desire to be seen as edgy mixed with come-down anxiety was a plausible explanation. After a while, though, one of USI was too fucked to remember who, but I hope it wasn't me, started to entertain his suggestions. Everybody there enjoy horror films after all. We'd had more than one 4 a.m. or hostile marathon after a night out. What was the harm? Soon enough we found ourselves in the familiar group cringe and out loud yes. There was then, of course, the unending debate over whatever macabre footage we'd just put ourselves through was real. We dug to the point of a woman using a kitchen knife to scalp herself, and a man pulling his own toes off with a pair of pliers when we found ... it. Luke's cousin was in control by that point. We hadn't noticed how quiet he'd gotten. He sat there on the floor, legs crossed, leaning forward every so often to click the next video. Had this look on his face the whole time, like he was searching for something specific. He never skipped anything, though. No matter what the video showed, he just sat back, watching whatever was making the rest of us make melodramatic retching noises unfold. Once one video finished, he scoured the algorithm's suggestions for the next. He'd ignored all of ours by this point, so we'd stopped bothering. We were more than a few blunts into our session, and holding our focus on anything other than the rich conversation about which of the girls we knew would be a good smash was difficult. I remember him sighing disappointedly at every video he found, except for the last. When he found that one, he licked his lips, rocking slightly. He must have known. No way the creepy little fuck found it by accident. When he clicked play, we all knew this one was going to be different. I'm not sure how, call if instinct. Something was off about it, which when you consider the kind of website we were surfing said a lot. Before the footage started, the rest of us had been laughing and joking in a blunt spoke tase. The vibe of the room switched in less than a heartbeat. The moment sound started to seep from the tinny speaker, every chemically stimulated mind enraptured by the figure on the 12-inch tablet screen. It was a girl younger than us, but older than Luke's cousin. Pretty, but not in the conventional sense. I say pretty because she wasn't exactly hot. Not the kind of looks you try and buy a drink. She had a pleasantness to the eye that I can't really quote in words. To describe her would make her sound plain, almost ugly. Drooping cheeks, large eyes surrounded by makeup done a little too much, lipstick ever so just the wrong shade of red, hair that had been brushed but was in obvious need of a wash. Not the sort of girl I'd give a second or third look under any other circumstance. In that smoky room she was all I could think about. The first 2 minutes of footage were her staring at the camera in front of a gray wall. The shot was well lit, and the camera was expensive. All the lines and imperfections of her face were visible. Her mic was clearly pricey, too. When she finally parted her lips, the sound of them peeling apart was quite audible. The breath between her words came through as though she were in the room with us. She talked for a whole 5 minutes before anything interesting happened. I don't know when the lads had last focused on something for that long at that time in the morning. Maybe never. Luke, Hunt, Jack, Lyle, and I all sat on the mattress and bean bags, hypnotized by the movement of her puffed lips, whispering semi-nonsense at us. She spoke a lot about necessity and excess, about evolution and optimization, deconstruction and renewal, subjects that didn't really seem to be linked to me at the time. It goes without saying I understand it all now, but then it just came across as meaningless word salad. It didn't matter. I would have listened to that face read even something as dull as the Bible for 500 years, if given the chance. She said her last words and held up a potato peeler. I didn't think much of it. I was too lost in those dark eyes of hers. She asked us all to remember that everything we do is to achieve perfection, something like that, at least. The exact phrasing doesn't matter. It's the idea that counts. Perfection out the room, with the exception of Luke's cousin, jumped in unison when the footage cut to black. The switch was accompanied with a loud crash, the sound of something heavy landing on the lowest notes of a grand piano. You can try this at home. Words appeared letter by letter in a white typewriter font. Sporadic detuned piano notes played over the scrolling text, along with muffled grunts and the scraping bangs of God knows what being dragged across the floor. The hair on my arms stood on end. I wasn't grinning and laughing anymore. I was still high, but barely. From the quick glances I exchanged with the rest of the lads, I could tell they were in a similar state. Everybody except Luke's cousin. Of course, he didn't look away from the screen, his eyes bulging, left one slipping into a slight twitch every time a new character of the message appeared. I happened to be watching him when the next scene started. The look of excitement disgusted me almost as much as the footage that inspired it. The camera had been moved about 10 feet away from the woman. For some reason, this didn't affect the definition of her face. The wrinkles of her top lip, the poorly concealed spot on her nostril, the blobs left over from over-generous application of eyeliner and mascara, all were just as clear as when she had been a few inches from the screen. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her drooping cheeks were slick with tears, and they wobbled in time with the trembling of her jaw. Her large eyes stared into the camera and to us, pleading for help. Both sides of the screen knew wasn't coming. She was still holding the potato peeler next to her head. Unlike her bottom lip, her grip was steady. We could see her clothes now, too. She was wearing a skirted suit, and an expensive one at that. My plan for after uni was to go into banking. I'm versed enough in tailoring to recognize quality fabric when I see it. The sobbing woman had on the uniform of the financially successful. The men stood either side of her were naked. They were each a few feet taller than her, an impressive feat, since even though she was sat down, you could tell the woman was tall. The length of her slender legs was a testament to this. The naked men were wider than her too, by a considerable margin. To say the sweating figures were morbidly obese would be an understatement. How their stubby legs supported their weight was a mystery to me. The hanging belly flab almost touched the floor. Their skin shone with grease, sweat, and dirt, and were it not for the fact I knew it's impossible, I would have sworn under oath that I could smell the pungent odor of curdled milk whenever I looked at either of them for too long. The one to her left was holding a transparent bucket filled with a clear liquid that I hoped was water. To her right was a silver tray. I can't comment on what the men looked like. I couldn't see their faces through the orange shopping bags over their heads. The cheap plastic was fastened in place with about a half-dozen zip ties round each man's neck. The crinkled skin pulled so taut that the shapes of their faces were visible. A pair of orange-bound skulls on the peaks of twin mountains of glistening flesh. The only movement from either was the steady in-out of the bag being pushed and pulled by labored breaths. Excess is the enemy of achievement. There was another piano crash. The letters didn't scroll out one by one this time, but appeared as a single block. They only hanged around for about half a second before the video took us back to the dusty floorboards, gray wall, sobbing girl, and her hulking guardians. Except she wasn't sobbing anymore. She wasn't smiling either. Even though her gaze was directly into the camera, Her expression was blank, still laced with an unexplainable magnetism, but the perk and spark from the segment where she spoke to us was gone. She raised the potato peeler in front of her face. Before I knew what was happening, she dragged the blade down in a single, uninterrupted motion. She didn't wince, didn't flinch, didn't register in any way the sharp metal slicing through the bridge of her nose. The removed flesh rolled itself into a damp curl as she peeled. It fell to the ground with a wet splat that was far too loud for comfort. Scarlet gush joined the streaks of dark makeup her earlier tears had dislodged. Pale bone was visible in the wound. The button tip of her nose hung on a thread from where the peeler had found its way to deep, and she had to yank it out. The blood pooled at the dangling chunk, dripping on her expensive skirt. She didn't even blink. Someone threw up. I could smell it, although the sounds of the hurling felt like they came from some other world. I was lost in the woman on the screen. I couldn't look away, and I didn't mean that my curiosity got the better of me. I was actively trying, putting so much strain into turning my head that veins on my neck began to bulge. My eyes throbbed, the tiny muscles used to move them, left and right screen, threatening to tear from the force I put on them, didn't work. I was helpless, sat on the dirty carpet, unable to stop watching as she dragged the gleaming metal. On occasion the blade would get clogged. When this happened, she would reach into the bucket, whisking the utensil around to remove the debris, clouds of red bloom in the water. The whole time her expression stayed unresponsive to the curls of skin piling up on the floor, the crimson wetness that consumed the lower half of her face, the open holes where her nostrils used to be. She should have screamed, but didn't. Part of me knew it was more accurate to say she couldn't. That part of me was the one that wanted to scream too. I was paralyzed and terrified. No matter how much strength of will I mustered, I couldn't turn my head away from the screen, couldn't shut my eyes, couldn't focus on anything other than the scraping of the peeler. Adrenaline and panic took over my mind. My body seemed to be getting different messages from the girl shearing off her own nose slice by slice. To my absolute disgust, I had pitch a tent. I had never felt uglier, more repulsive in my life. I'm not a psycho or a pervert. I'm not. All I wanted to do was not watch. The footage must have tapped into something deep, some latent human infatuation with violence in all of us. That's the only explanation, surely. It's not like a video could hijack your body. Beauty. Such minimalist piano crash was louder this time. Closer to the microphone, again, the words only last about half a second. When the trio returned, the small nub of exposed bone was gone. A triangle of open flesh lay at the center of the woman's face, her nose now in wet spirals on her lap and around her feet. The cheeks were next. It was around the time that teeth started to be exposed that I hurled. The entrapment was so strong by this point I could no longer steal quick glances at the bars, but I could hear many of them doing the same. It was a struggle getting the vomit out. I couldn't bend over far enough due to the paralysis, and had to cough it out mouthful by burning mouthful. One of them was laying on their back when the video started. I could tell by the gargled crying that it was hot. I felt a tear fall down my cheek, unable to look away from the woman peeling her lower jaw down to the bone as the wails behind me coughed into drowned silence. Somebody managed to get out an almost inaudible whimper. Even though my vision was blurred with tears, I could still make out the half-skeleton in the video. I watched the screen, spitting up the occasional chunk of regurgitated kebab meat as the blurred figure reached to her right. The woman took to objects from the silver tray that I couldn't quite make out. The orange-headed blob next to her didn't move, But even through the watery haze, I could still just about make out the steady rhythm of its breath beneath the bag. For the first time in my life, I was happy to be crying. The weakness in character put up a partial shield, blurring and censoring whatever I was about to see once the woman had positioned the objects next to her dripping half-face. You will watch crashing came from behind, the unseen pianist slamming on the keys only a few feet away. Something forced me to blink, and I mean that in a very literal sense. It wasn't voluntary, it wasn't a reflex, it was done on command. A command from who or what I didn't know. My eyes slammed shut and were quickly wrenched open again by an indescribable and overbearing impulse. All traces of tears were gone. The video swam back into focus just in time to catch the downward swing of the hammer. Exposed jawbone swung outwards, the chisel following through and digging itself in the underside of the lolling tongue. The limp muscle fell to her throat with a wet slap, hanging there behind the dangling jaw for all to see. The girl was calm when she placed the tools in her lap and reached up for the partially detached bone. Her expression didn't change when she tweaked it loose, discarding her own jaw on the floor with the skin peelings as though she had just picked a scab on top of everything else. The stiffness in my jeans hadn't subsided. Were my stomach not empty, I would have vomited again, as much from self-disgust as the nightmare Luke's cousin had pulled me into. See what she gives for you. She removes all but the most necessary features. Unseen pianist was closer now. But what concentration I still had was focused on Luke's cousin. I could just about see him out of the corner of my eye. He was blinking. I noticed that straight away because I couldn't unless ordered to. Laying on the floor, less than 10 inches from the screen, his young face was illuminated a ghostly blue by the light from the tablet. I couldn't pull my attention on him much, the video wouldn't allow it, but I could have sworn he managed to shoot the occasional gleeful glance at the rest of us. I was able to notice him enough to see how his wide grin didn't falter, how the joy in his adolescent eyes didn't fade as the woman on screen reached towards her own with the steel ice cream scoop. My own eyes burned with each steady flick of the woman's wrists. My eyelids howled at me, fighting a losing war to close themselves, trying even though it was hopeless to shield my mind from the sight of those blooded once white orbs plopping to the ground. I had to cough down empty heaves when the second one rolled towards the camera. The fading pupil locked on my own. It was judging me, and I knew why. The reason I nearly choked on my own vomit wasn't just because of the footage, though. The disgust was far more at my own body than at anything the video forced me to watch the girl do to hers. I could feel the wetness in my boxes the moment at first I squelched on the floorboards. Every spasm haunted me, every muscular convulsion scarring me for life. Outside of the nightmare, before it, I had earned the half-joking nickname of Big Shagger on campus. I'd never hated myself for it before now. It wasn't until the girl started removing the skin of her brow like a face mask that the twitching stopped. My brain must have worked out that shutting my eyes wasn't going to happen. My extremities went numb. The heavy knot in my stomach became a rising lightness, an unpleasant floating sensation that nights of being blackout drunk had left me all too familiar with. The room spun one way, my insides another. The space behind my eyes prickled. I could feel myself slipping into a blissful unconsciousness. I urged the process on. I was desperate to be out of the nightmare, and if passing out was the only way, then so be it. The hand had other ideas. She obliges, she obeys, she complies. This is all for you. He could feel the clammy grip on the back of my head. The fingers worked their way through my hair, pulling in, tugging to make sure I had no respite from my own depraved nature. Every time my head lolled forwards, it would be wrenched back, the fog of unconsciousness fanned away again and again. I could hear sobs and whimpers from every direction that is except where Luke's cousin sat. I could feel his grin, the cracks of his laughter flecking my wet face, the hanging smoke in the air. That stodgy scent of cheap weed and even cheaper cigarettes grew thicker by the second. It snaked through my mouth and nostrils, coating the inside of my lungs with heavy phlegm that left my breathing like that of a drowning man. I gagged for a final time, blood and bile spewing onto the already vomit-sodden carpet. Perfection's crashing in my ear canal timed itself perfectly with the moment the woman grasped her own hair and pulled. The scalp came clean off, the fluid motion leaving a glistening skull caked in chunks of red and purple. The text came just as my brain had time to process the final masterpiece. The girl stood tall, proud even, with the two sweating mountains of fat either side of her, the plastic of the bags on their heads still moving with that slow in-out rhythm. The floorboards they stood on were awash with blood, a pile of fleshy curls at the woman's high heels, the single eye staring at the camera. On top of it, Perfection, the word sliced through the crystal image. My dick recoiled the instant it was cut off from the shaved half-face. To my shock and self-hatred, I was wincing from the sudden removal of the eyeless stare, the tongue lolling free on a jawless neck. My head swam, joints ached, eyes burned, yet through the taste of vomit and heaving of raw lungs, only one thought crossed my mind. Perfection. As soon as I could move, I didn't hesitate. I heard shouting behind me as I slammed the door. Luke and his cousin at each other, Lyle calling Hunt's name over and over, Jack screeching incomprehensible gibberish. I didn't care. I booked it from Luke's room and out into the hallway without looking back. I don't really remember the journey to my end of the building very well. I remember taking off my clothes as I ran, throwing the vomit-crusted t-shirt and soaked pants into the corridor. I left my phone, keys, wallet. I'm usually protective of the necessities, but in the wee hours of that morning they didn't matter. Nothing did, save for removing as much of what had transpired from myself as possible. People laughed when they saw me spreading naked through the halls, but the laughter quickly turned to shrieks and startled mutters as they came close enough to see the blood and puke slathering my lips. Somehow I kicked down the door to my room. I'm not a strong guy. That desperation and adrenaline meant the old hinge gave way after to blows. Once sure the door was firmly barricaded by my wardrobe, I screamed my way through an hour-long shower. With the temperature up full, the water scaled my skin, at one point leaving actual blisters on my forearms, but it wasn't hot enough. Neither was the bleach I gray-rid in with a scouring pad from the kitchen. Once drips of reddish water started to drip from the end of my shame, I gave up, collapsing into a sobbing heap on the tiles. When I woke, the shower was still on, but had long since run cold. I dragged myself into my bedroom, glad that the curtains were still closed. Once I remembered that I had lost my phone. My laptop informed me it was 17:30. I'd slept for about 13 hours. Usually I don't dream after a session. The spliffs and lines take care of that. But on the tiled floor my dreams had been vivid, more lucid than I had ever experienced. Perfection. The word rang and regurgitated over and over in real time. Over half a day of formless contemplation of the meaning behind the word the revelatory film had instilled within me. Perfection. I checked Facebook and awoke to a horde of messages. The lads had been busy whilst I slept. Luke had killed his cousin. About 10 minutes after I had gone, the argument turned into a fist fight. Although from Lyle's punctuation-free 1,000-word-long message, I could tell it was less of a fight and more of a murder. Before Lyle knew what to do, Luke had grabbed his cousin's head, smashing the grinning face into a mirror over and over again. until the nose was flat and shards of glass found their way through eyelids and into gray matter. Hunt had choked on his own vomit, but that's no surprise. After killing his cousin, Luke tried to rope Lyle and Jack into helping roll up both bodies in a duvet to dump somewhere. When Lyle refused, Luke had gone at him with a shard of glass. Jack was in no state to do anything, so Lyle grabbed him and they both legged it. The status update at the top of my news feed let me know what happened to Luke once they'd gone. Charlotte, Luke's flatmate, was going to need therapy for a long time, maybe forever. She was never one to shy away from details of her grievances online, and this time was no different. Her recollection of events would have been harrowing had it not been for my awakening. Upon barging through his door to investigate strange noises, she had found Luke naked, kneeling on to face-down bodies. I imagine she didn't stick around long enough to find out who they were, or she had been told not to by the police she later mentioned had arrived. But I knew he was laughing, crying, screaming, every emotion it was possible to feel. A shrieking monster surrounded by the dead and shards of blooded mirror, the part that would truly disturb Charlotte, the part that would give her recurring nightmares of what should have been any normal morning, was what he clenched in his hands and mouth. 3 sets of severed male genitals, judging by her capitalized paragraph. Luke had a large wound between his legs that confirmed one of them was his own. Perfection. Flicking my eyes back to the message told me things hadn't gone much better in Jack and Lyle's flat. They lived on the 7th floor, a fact that Lyle wasn't quick enough to stop Jack exploiting. To prevent exactly what Jack had been planning, the large windows only opened a few inches. Lyle heard the glass smash, but was only able to kick the door through in time to catch the sight of Jack's ankles disappearing beyond the sill. By the time Lyle reached the window, Jack was a red crater on the concrete. A quick glance outside my curtain showed me at least 6 pairs of flashing lights. The door supervisor was talking to a police officer, pointing up at my window. I knew what I had to do, but didn't have long to do it. Perfection. Lyle's single quotes message had ended there. There was no further communication from him, but I didn't need any. Lyle was smart. He would be doing the same as myself, I imagine. Maybe he already has. There was a couple of ambulances outside, too, and they don't take away the dead in ambulances, or maybe they do. I'd never been around a dead body before last night, so I'm not exactly what you'd call an expert. Something in my gut told me that Lyle was in one of them. I could sense him, awakened mind to awakened mind. I could see him sat in that ambulance, the paramedics shrieking, his head free of the unnecessary baggage that would have allowed him to see their frantic tear-stained faces. Not long now, Lyle. I'll be with you soon. Perfection. Moving the barricade. Interrupting my flatmates' romantic dinner, ignoring their screams as I threw the fridge in front of the door, stabbing them until they made no more noise, finding the potato peeler at the back of the cupboard. All of these I found easy. I had purpose now. I made sure to add the bed to the wardrobe when resealing my bedroom door behind me. I needed time, a resource that the hammering on the door to the flat beyond the barricade told me I didn't have. I could hear somebody shouting my name, a deep male voice, human in a way that I soon would not be. Perfection. I grasped the potato peeler in my hand. My palms were sweating, but not from nerves. It was anticipation. No, not anticipation, excitement. The same excitement I used to feel in that moment where a girl throws you down on her bed and unhooks her bra. The plastic pressed into my fingers felt realer than any woman I had ever touched. I gazed at myself in the mirror. Bloodshot eyes, a hooked nose, lips dried out from too many cigarettes, and late nights, all of it holding me back, all of it clouding my vision for so long. I didn't wince as the peeler made its first incision. I'm so glad I watched that fucking video. Perfection. It was a chilly evening a few weeks ago when my friend Jason and I found ourselves indulging in the dark corners of the internet for our particular amusement. We would quite often peruse the dark web, trying to find the strangest things you could in that lawless place. We'd been doing it for years, since we first got access to the dark web back in high school when Jason found out about the Tor. We'd seen everything, from drug sites to snuff sites, but on this particular evening, a peculiar link caught our attention. It was titled Delittle's Bizarre. Intrigued, we clicked the link. A digital menagerie showcasing exotic animals of all kinds opened up in front of us. It was obviously run by poachers and boasted a large amount of endangered and rare species. Mesmerized by the bizarre collection, we scrolled through the listings, intrigued by the curiosities on display. It had everything, from mundane tropical fish to incredibly rare big cats. We were amazed. Amidst the virtual oddities, a seemingly innocuous pop-up materialized, advertising a dog, claiming that it was unlike any other. This dog is made just for you. It's astonishingly intelligent, capable of comprehending and executing any command, the perfect companion, it read. Its price tag was unusually low for what was being offered, almost too good to be true. Being the animal lover of the two of us, Jason decided to take the plunge, succumbing to the allure of owning a unique and brilliant canine companion, as well as the possibility of rescuing the creature from the hands of the poachers. They're probably mistreating the poor thing anyway. You know what poachers can be like. I've seen videos online. Besides, no one else in the world will have one like it, he said, as though trying to justify his purchase. I warned him that it was probably a scam, but he was determined, as though he'd already made up his mind, but was now coming up with a justification. He always got like this whenever it came to animals, always leading with his heart. I know it's risky, I'm not stupid, but what if it's legitimate? What if that poor creature is suffering and I can do something about it now? He said, with the nonchalant click of a button, he entered his payment details and placed the order. A sense of apprehension filled me as he clicked the button and the screen flashed payment processed. I wasn't sure why at the time. I think it was just a general distrust of the dark web. After all, we'd seen a lot of things on there before. Well, said Jason, let's see what happens. Worst case, I've just lost some money. Best case, I've rescued an animal. We carried on searching through random links in the dark web, but at the back of our minds was the excitement to see Jason's new dog, as well as the anxiety as to whether it was even real at all. You could never be too careful on the dark web. Jason went home later that night, and the events of the evening gradually faded from our minds. Several weeks passed by with no sign of the dog. There was nothing from the company on the deep web either. We both assumed that it had been a scam and that Jason had just lost his money. I told you so, I goaded. Each time I saw him a few days after that, an obscure package arrived at my friend's doorstep. It was a huge box, larger than anything he'd ever ordered before. You could easily fit a full-length sofa inside and still have room to spare. Strapped to the top was a note, printed on plain paper, with no discerning marks. It read, "Your very own unique companion is here. We hope you enjoy it." Below, in the red text, were the words, "No refunds, no returns, wasting no time." Jason called me. "It's here, the dog from the deep web. It's arrived. The box is massive, but I can hear it moving around inside," he practically shouted down the phone in excitement. Point one to Jason for always being right. What? Really? Haha, okay. You win this one, Mr. Awesome, I responded, amazed that something actually had turned up. I'll swing by after work and meet the new furball. Sweet. See you then, he said in that same excited tone. Then he hung up. I couldn't help a feeling of excitement welling up in my stomach. I wasn't exactly an animal lover myself. I could take or leave them. But I was still excited to see this new dog. As soon as I finished work, I made my way over to his house as quickly as I could, interested to see what made the dog so unique. Knocking on the door, Jason slowly opened it, his head poking out gingerly from behind it. So where is it? I asked, trying to glance over his shoulder. Come on, I want to see it. Yeah, okay. Come in, Jason said, his voice quivering slightly, a stark contrast to his confident tone over the phone mere hours ago. I made my way into the house, but there was no sign of the creature that had been delivered. It's in the basement, Jason said, again in that shaking voice. Now very confused by what was going on, I followed as he led me to the basement. As soon as he opened the door, I was met with an odd stench. Not something I'd ever smelt before. It was a sickly sweet smell, with a hint of iron. I couldn't help a feeling of apprehension in my gut as I stared down the staircase into the black abyss. Inside the basement was dark. There was a small old light in the middle of the basement, illuminating a small area and casting long shadows across the floor. As I made my way down, the smell was much stronger, nearly suffocating me. I could make out sounds, too. There's no way I could describe those sounds. They seemed like a low grunting noise, but there was a high-pitched, pained quality to it. There's no way that sound was made by a dog. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I could see a large metal cage in the far corner of the basement. It had thick iron bars and a heavy-looking padlock on the gate. The floor was covered in sawdust. The sounds seemed to be emanating from further within. Come here, girl, Jason beckoned, again a quiver in his voice. My eyes remained fixed on the cage, awaiting the reveal of his peculiar new companion. The creature inside it obeyed his command, moving into the dim light. I had to stifle a scream. There's no way that thing could be a dog. It was hairless, with large, red-looking welts all over its body that were held together with stitches. If I had to describe it, I would say that it appeared as if someone had crudely amalgamated human components to create a macabre imitation of a canine form. That it was breathing that same low grunt with a high-pitched whine, as though its every breath was pained. Its face looked stretched, like the skin was pulled back, almost into a grimace of constant agony. I almost feel sorry for the wretched thing if it wasn't so repulsive. Double quote so. God, I said, not sure of what else to say. All words left me, I know. It's horrible, isn't it? I didn't think this is what they'd send. I was expecting something like a really obedient Doberman or something, but not this thing. Jason said. I could hear the sadness and disappointment in his voice. He almost couldn't bear to look at it either. It looks like it's been so badly mistreated. The poor thing. Can you return it? I asked, still looking at the thing in the cage, that same sense of revulsion filling me. No, there are no returns. I'm stuck with her, Jason said in a frustrated tone. Why don't you just give her to a rescue center or release her into the wild or something then? I asked. I can't do that, Jason snapped, almost offended. Look at her. Nobody'd take her for one, and she doesn't look like she'd survive in the wild on her own. She needs help. I felt so sorry for Jason. He seemed genuinely upset by the creature in the cage that he was now stuck with. He was a compassionate person, and I could see that this dilemma about what to do and the need to help was eating away at him inside. "All right," I said. "If you're going to keep this thing, we can't just call it that horrible thing. What are you going to call it? Got any ideas, demon dog or Scooby don't?" He thought for a second before saying Lucy. Lucy had been his grandmother's name. She'd passed away, and he was really young. "Yeah, I think I want to call her Lucy in the days following Lucy's arrival." Jason retreated further into his house, isolating himself from friends and social interactions. Whenever we managed to catch a glimpse of him, an uncharacteristic skittishness or edge hung about him, a stark contrast to his usual demeanor. He'd still speak and behave like the Jason we all knew, but he seemed distracted, as though he was constantly preoccupied with something. He also started dressing differently, wearing long clothing that covered most of his body regardless of the outside temperature, whereas before he was a shorts and t-shirt kind of guy. Every time I would ask him about Lucy, he would respond with something like, "She's good. Yeah, or she's getting there." But he wouldn't go into much detail. You could see it on his face, a look of conflict, as though he wanted to confide something in us, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. In the weeks that followed, Jason had gotten worse. It was rare that anyone could get in contact with him at all. When we did see him, he was now skinny, gone to imitation of the healthy, happy Jason we knew before. He looked incredibly pale and sickly. He'd also developed an odd limp in his right leg. When we asked him about what was happening to him, he would laugh it off, saying that the doctors were investigating. But his expression didn't seem to portray the same feeling. He looked worried, almost scared. On the very rare occasions that he did come out with us, he'd normally only stay for a couple of hours before making some excuse to go back home. We were all worried about him. Unable to ignore the signs of his deteriorating condition, I mustered the courage to check on him. When I arrived at his house, I pressed the doorbell, waiting a while for an answer. When none came, I knocked on the door, assuming that the bell may not be plugged. As I knocked, the door opened slowly. It was unlocked. Doubt this was strange. Jason didn't normally leave his door unlocked. With a sense of unease now stirring in my stomach, I made my way into the house, shouting Jason's name in the hopes that he would hear me. His house exuded an eerie silence, and a deeper sense of foreboding enveloped me as I made my way further into the house. It was empty. There was no sign of anyone there at all. It hadn't been cleaned in what looked like ages either. The sink was overflowing with washing up, and the bins were at the point of spilling over. I shouted for Jason again. Still no answer. I was beginning to get really worried about him now. Growing increasingly concerned, I combed through the house, my anxiety escalating. Amidst my search, a thick booklet perched atop a cabinet caught my eye. Its appearance suggested recent handling, urging me to inspect it. Picking it up, I turned it over and read the cover. It looked like a manual with a picture of a creature that looked like Lucy on the front. "So you own a sanguisuga," Canis was sprawled in a large font at the top. Perplexed, I flicked through its pages. Sanguisuga Canis was the Latin for bloodhound. The creature my friend had purchased on the dark web was a very rare and old subspecies of canine that subsisted entirely on blood. They were so exceedingly rare because of their metabolism. They could only go 6 to 8 hours between feeds until their bodies began to digest themselves, and they starved to death. Horror and dread washed over me as I realized the extent of my friend's situation. I continued searching the house with a more frantic urgency, shouting for Jason, but still receiving no answer. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed that the basement door was wide open. I could smell that same sickly smell of decay wafting up. It was stronger now, and even more nauseating now that I knew it was due to decaying blood. I could also hear sounds from down there, the same low growl and whine as before, but there was another sound mixed in that I couldn't put my finger on. Tentatively, I ventured into the depths of his basement, terrified as to what I would find there. I couldn't bring myself to shout for Jason. It sounds silly, but the sounds in the basement sent shivers through me, so much so that I was too afraid to utter a sound. As I neared the bottom of the stairs, I poked my head around a corner, and into the dim gloom I discovered Jason lying unconscious in the middle of the basement under that light. He was pale, deathly pale. I ran over to him, my fears being pushed to the back of my mind, overpowered by a deep concern for my friend. I rolled him over and tried to wake him, but he was completely unresponsive. I checked for a pulse, any sign of breathing or anything else that would show me that my friend was alive. There was nothing. I shook him again, begging him to wake up. The feeling of devastation was crushing. I was doing my best not to break down, but I could feel the hot tears welling up in my eyes. Jason, my best friend, was gone. I was so confused. What had happened? I knew that he was sick, but I had no idea he was this far gone. Why hasn't he said anything to me? I pulled him close and hugged him, beginning to cry, as though if I hugged him hard enough it might bring him back. He was cold as ice. He was really gone. Slowly I laid his body back down gently onto the basement floor. As I lowered him, I noticed a piece of paper had dropped from his clenched fist. I turned to pick it up, and as I grabbed it, my eyes perceived something that I'm not sure I'll ever forget. Emerging from Jason's right leg, a grotesque and sinewy appendage, resembling a nightmarish vine, slithered into my line of sight. Its fleshy color clashed starkly against his pallid skin, with a labyrinth of capillaries that seemed to writhe and pulse with pulsating crimson fluid. The eerie, almost dance-like undulations propelled the liquid in a disturbing rhythm, leading the eye along the horrifying path into the abyss of Lucy's cage, as if called to action by observation. The tube disconnected from Jason's leg with an audible pop before slowly retracting back into the cage. Then there was a low growl as Lucy made her way forward. She was much larger than the last time I saw her, with red stains around her mouth where the tube was now receding. Her stomach was also distended and bloated, a deep red color compared with the rest of her pale frame. She looked me in the eyes with her cold gaze, and let out another threatening growl. I began to back away, noticing the heavy padlock of the cage door on the floor just beyond Jason. A jolt of fear shot through me. She was loose. Without a second thought, I ran. Fear clenched my heart as I scrambled up the stairs, propelled by sheer survival instinct. Reaching the top, I slammed the door shut and barricaded it with a chair. The door thudded seconds later, as though Lucy had thrown herself at it as hard as she could. The door rattled violently, and the chair visibly shook, but it held. She made an awful noise, like a roar, but nothing like I'd heard before, but she couldn't get out. Desperation clouded my mind as I grappled with the dilemma before me. I couldn't let that abomination escape, not now that I knew what it was, but nor could I bear to confront the monstrosity that killed my best friend. I felt an overwhelming sense of entrapment and exhaustion, as if the weight of the entire ordeal was crashing down on me. With the main danger now sealed behind the door, the reality of the situation settled in, threatening to drown me in a tidal wave of emotions. The grief I'd felt in the basement when I saw Jason's body, my fear as I realized Lucy was loose, and now the dilemma of what to do with her. I made my way over to Jason's couch, needing to sit and try to process this, trying to figure out what I needed to do next. As I sat down, I remembered the piece of paper that had fallen from Jason's hand as I lowered him to the floor, the paper I was picking up just as I noticed that horrific proboscis. In the ensuing chaos, I'd stuffed it into my pocket, not wanting to lose the last remnant of my friend. Taking it out of my pocket, I smoothed it out. It was a note addressed to me. It would make sense he'd know that I'd be the one to come looking for him. I began to read the rest of the note. Jason had written the note in his final moments, trying to explain why he'd been so distant and strange lately, and apologizing for how he'd been acting towards me and my friends. He explained that he'd not had any other way to feed Lucy, so he had been using his own blood every 8 hours to feed the creature. He knew it was draining him, gradually killing him, but he didn't want her to die. She was a living thing and endangered. He'd said she deserves to live, but he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it up. He asked me to forgive him, going on to say that he'd valued our friendship above all else. I placed the note down, tears welling up in my eyes. I sat there for hours, finding myself grappling with the knowledge that the creature's thirst for blood had been what had taken my best friend from me, and if I didn't act, it would soon lead to its demise. But my best friend sacrificed his life to keep the thing alive, and if I let it die, then he'll have given his life for nothing. I've still not made a decision yet, but I can't hear anything from the basement anymore. I guess there's no harm giving her a bit of mine for the moment, just to keep her alive while I decide. Yeah, just this once.